Okay, today we're going to talk about Barack Obama, president from 2009 to 2017. In the election of 2008, Democrats nominated, first they had a long primary battle with former First Lady and U.S. Senator Hillary Clinton versus a 47-year-old charismatic African-American junior senator from Illinois, Barack Obama. Barack Obama ultimately got the Democratic nod. Obama picked Senator Joseph Biden from Delaware as his running mate. The Republicans nominated Senator John McCain of Arizona, who was a Vietnam War hero and a political maverick who hoped to appeal to undecided voters. McCain briefly led in the polls, but the economic crisis, Obama's message of change, and a well-funded grassroots campaign helped the Democrats win in November. The Democrats also increased their majorities in the House and Senate. Obama became the first African-American president in U.S. history. He also faced the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. He had 2 unfinished U.S. wars to deal with and a world increasingly skeptical of U.S. power and leadership. So Obama's domestic policy included placing a formal ban on torture by requiring that Army field manuals be used as the guide for interrogating terrorist suspects. He expanded stem cell research. He ended restrictions on federal funding of overseas health organizations. He established the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which strengthened protection of equal pay for female employees. He promised to close the U.S. prison at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, but he failed to win the needed congressional support to do that. And Democrats controlled the House and briefly had enough Senate votes to stop filibusters to pass legislation with little Republican support. They confirmed Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan to the Supreme Court during this time. As for Obama's domestic policy, the Great Recession had started in late 2007, and the stock market lost half of its value, and unemployment peaked at more than 10%. Obama and the Democrats enacted a number of programs to promote recovery and financial reform. Major part of that was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. It provided a $787 billion economic stimulus package designed to create or save 3.5 million jobs. There was $288 billion for tax cuts to stimulate spending, $144 billion to help state and local governments maintain jobs and services. The rest of it was for construction projects, healthcare, education, and renewable energy. And the Federal Reserve promoted recovery, where they lowered interest rates and injected $600 billion into the banking system. The domestic auto industry was near collapse, so the government temporarily took over General Motors while it went through bankruptcy. And they guided the sale of Chrysler to Fiat, an Italian automaker. And then the Cash for Clunkers program provided $3 billion in incentives to U.S. residents to scrap old cars in order to promote sales and to purchase new, more fuel-efficient vehicles. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010 was designed to improve regulations of banking and investment firms and to protect taxpayers from future bailouts of, quote, too big to fail businesses. They set up a new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to regulate consumer products like mortgages and credit cards. And they were criticized for not breaking up the big banks that had contributed to the meltdown of the economy and needed the bailouts. By late 2016, the economy looked far stronger than it had in 2010. It had added 15 million jobs, the unemployment rate had fallen to 4.6%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average was up 210%. The Obama administration is still criticized, though, for a slow recovery, and a lower percentage of Americans were working than before the recession. Okay, so now we get to one of the most controversial parts of Obama's presidency, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, also known as Obamacare. So the U.S. fee-for-service medical system was the most expensive in the world, but it produced mixed results. It promoted innovation, but it left more than 45 million people outside of the system to seek medical care in emergency rooms. So Obamacare was aiming to extend affordable health care insurance to an additional 25 million Americans through combinations of subsidies, mandates, insurance exchanges, and expansion of Medicaid while introducing medical and insurance reforms to control healthcare costs. So, major parts of it were that it required insurance companies to accept patients regardless of pre-existing conditions, which, by the way, women being like having kids, that was considered a pre-existing condition. It allowed children to remain on their parents' insurance until the age of 26, and it funded wellness exams and women's medical needs. Republicans opposed the law for its regulations and its costs, and 20 million Americans were able to gain coverage through private health insurance or through Medicaid, thanks to the Affordable Care Act. As for environment and climate change, he promoted reduced reliance on oil and increased development of alternative energy sources like solar and wind power. Auto manufacturers were encouraged to produce more hybrid and electric cars. In 2015, the U.S. joined the Paris Agreement with 195 other nations to reduce global carbon emissions. Many in Congress disagreed with the science behind global warming and opposed tighter controls of greenhouse gases. As for education, the race to the top in K-12 education led to more private and public partnerships and more uses of charter schools. Democrats attacked the growing college loan debt crisis by cutting out private banks in the federal college loan program. Now, Every Student Succeeds Act was signed in 2015 and replaced No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind was attacked for excessive testing and for supporting efforts to develop a common curriculum standard across the country. And Every Student Succeeds Act placed more emphasis on local and state flexibility. As for the budget, the total national debt under Obama ballooned from $10.6 trillion to $19.9 trillion, which was an 88% increase. Democrats opposed cuts to social services and Republicans fought tax increases. There was a struggle with compromise between the two political parties, which we still see today. And there was renewed economic growth, which reduced the annual deficit from over 9% of the GDP to about 3% in 2016. Politically, there was a conservative and libertarian movement known as the Tea Party. They were opposed to growing national debt and Obamacare. They emphasized an expansion of gun rights, outlawing abortions, and preventing undocumented immigration. The Republicans were fueled by the Tea Party energy, and the Republicans were able to take control of the House in 2010 and reduce the Democrats' majority in the Senate. As for elections and money, in the Supreme Court case Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations were considered legal persons and had the same rights as individuals to buy ads to influence political elections. Basically, it opened a flood of new money into politics from wealthy donors. In the Supreme Court case Snyder versus Phelps, it upheld that protests of public concern are entitled to greater protection thanks to free speech from the First Amendment. In Arizona versus Intertribal Council of Arizona, the Supreme Court invalidated a state law that required proof of citizenship during voter registration process. And in Riley versus California, the Supreme Court protected the privacy of digital information on cell phones. In the election of 2012, it was dominated by issues related to the Great Recession, the Affordable Care Act, illegal immigration, and the long-term fiscal health of the United States. Republicans nominated Mitt Romney, who you see there on the right. He was the former governor of Massachusetts, picked as the nominee after a long, hard-fought battle for their party's nomination. The Democrats renominated President Obama. Obama defeated Romney 332 to 206 in the Electoral College and by 5 million popular votes. The president ran strongly among Hispanics, winning 71% of their votes. The Republicans kept a strong majority in the House, and Democrats retained control of the Senate. In the election of 2014, Republicans were able to take control of both the House and the Senate. The government was essentially in deadlock at this point. You've got divisions between Obama and the Republican-controlled Congress being so serious that Standard & Poor's downgraded the government's credit rating. That doesn't happen very often. So compromise was difficult and increasingly rare. There was little significant legislation that was signed into law. There were budget stalemates. Republicans threatened to default on the national debt. Republicans tried more than 50 times to overturn or defund the Affordable Care Act without success during Obama's presidency. In January 2013, they preserved tax cuts for incomes of $400,000 and less and allowed the top tax rate to rise to 39.6 for higher incomes. There were automatic cuts or sequestrations that occurred on both domestic and defense spending. In October 2013, the Republicans shut down the federal government for 16 days. And Senate Republicans refused to hold hearings for Obama's Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland, leading the Supreme Court with only 8 members for 13 months. When the Supreme Court is deadlocked at 4-4, it cannot rule on decisions made in the lower federal courts. So that's why you always have an odd number on the Supreme Court. As for LGBT rights, in 2009, Congress made it a federal crime to assault someone because of sexual orientation or gender identity. In 2010, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed to end discrimination against gays and lesbians in the military. In 2012, Obama came out in support of equal marriage rights. In 2013, the Supreme Court declared that the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional, and they let stand a California court's overturning of a state law banning same-sex marriage. Within a few years, over 30 states allowed same-sex marriage by legislation or by court order. The Supreme Court case of Obergefell versus Hodges ruled that the 14th Amendment protects the right of same-sex couples to get married. As for gun rights and gun violence, the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia in District of Columbia versus Heller. There was a mass shooting of 26 children and teachers in Connecticut at Sandy Hook. There was a mass shooting of 9 African Americans in a South Carolina church. Obama's proposals to tighten gun laws and background checks to keep guns out of the hands of people with mental health problems went nowhere in Congress because of opposition from the gun advocates like the National Rifle Association, also known as the NRA. And the killing of unarmed Black teenagers and men by police during arrests sparked a Black Lives Matter movement to demand reforms in police training and arrest procedures. As for immigration, in 2012, Obama took executive action to protect undocumented young people brought to the United States as children, also known as dreamers, from deportation and allow them to continue their education and apply for work permits. Further action to expand it in 2014 was challenged by 26 states and blocked by a federal judge. There was a lot of anger at Obama's immigration policies, which increased, even though the number of border guards was increased, deportations for undocumented immigrants increased, and the total undocumented immigrant population decreased during his administration. Homegrown terrorists were self-radicalized by extremist Islamic propaganda. They led to issues at Fort Hood in Texas, a shooting in 2009, the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013, the San Bernardino, California shooting in 2015, and a nightclub in Orlando, Florida shooting in 2016. The Bush and Obama administrations spent billions on intelligence, airport security, federal agents, and support for local and state governments to stop terrorist attacks. Acts of isolated individuals proved difficult to stop, however. As for foreign policy, he was reluctant to use large-scale military actions that would put many U.S. troops on the ground. He preferred negotiations, targeted operations by special forces, and drone attacks. In Iraq in 2009, there was a focus on winding down ground combat operations, and by 2011, the last U.S. forces were withdrawn. Afterwards, the Sunni and Shiite Muslims erupted in violence. In Afghanistan, fighting al-Qaeda and the Taliban was a priority. In 2012, a long-term partnership agreement with Afghanistan was signed, and in 2014, there was a focus to train and support the Afghan military. In May 2011, Osama bin Laden, leader of al-Qaeda, was killed in Pakistan. There was also an Arab Spring happening. So in June 2009, Obama traveled to Egypt and gave a speech at the University of Cairo calling for a new beginning between the Islamic world and the United States. In 2010, protests across the Middle East and North Africa were called an Arab Spring. Civil unrest and armed rebellion overthrew governments in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen. The Syrian civil war also caused a massive humanitarian crisis with 12.5 million Syrian refugees. There's also the rise of ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIL. They vowed to create a worldwide caliphate under strict Islamic law. They are a well-financed movement using social media to recruit fighters from around the world. Obama committed American air power and trainers to help Iraq regain lost territories. The white banner at the top of the flag reads, "There is no God but Allah. Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." This phrase is a declaration of faith used across Islam and is known as the Shahada. Underneath is a white circle emblazoned with black writing reading, "Muhammad is the messenger of God," which is meant to resemble the prophet's seal, similar to that used to close an envelope. In 2015, there was an agreement that would prevent Iran from developing and producing nuclear bombs for at least 15 years. Republicans opposed the agreement because it released the frozen assets of Iran, which it could use for conventional weapons and terrorism. In Asia, the Trans-Pacific Partnership included the U.S. and 11 other Pacific nations, excluding China, in a trade deal. The U.S. Senate did not ratify it. The American public opinion was against globalization at this point. China created new territories on islands in the South China Sea, which you can see on the map there, the area that they were claiming. They threatened Southeast Asian nations and the free passage through international waters guarded by the U.S. Navy. North Korea also developed nuclear weapons and long-range missiles during this time. As for Europe, the European Union struggled with a debt crisis following the Great Recession, especially in Greece. There was a resurgence of nationalism among people who were worried they were losing jobs and national identities due to the EU open borders and fiscal austerity programs. As for Russia, in 2014, Ukraine's pro-Russian government was overthrown by a popular pro-Western movement. Russia under Putin responded by orchestrating a revolt of pro-Russian partisans in eastern Ukraine and annexed the militarily strategic Crimea region, which you can see in red on the map. The US and European nations placed economic sanctions on Russia and its leaders. Russia also intervened in Syria's civil war. By the end of Obama's second term, US-Russia relations were at the lowest point since the end of the Cold War. As for Cuba, in 2015, the U.S. and Cuba agreed to open embassies in Havana and Washington and to resume direct flights for the first time since the Eisenhower administration. There were also major cyber attacks during this time period, which included stealing digital data. Cyber warfare is a major method that incapacitates the computerized networks that operate other countries' electrical power grids. The Russians, Chinese, Iranians, and others use cyber attacks to steal U.S. private and governmental digital data, including credit card and personnel records. They have also used cyber warfare to influence social media and influence our elections. In 2016, Russian agents hacked into emails of the Hillary Clinton campaign and distributed the information through the anti-secrecy group WikiLeaks in an effort to disrupt the U.S. election.